Well, howdy, friends. Pastor Mike McCain with Raymond United Methodist Church in Raymond, Minnesota, bringing you the message for this weekend, February 27th and 28th. And we're glad that you were able to join us today by this YouTube video. You know, in recent weeks, we've been talking about the great story of God, and last week we talked about Joseph and how he overcame incredible adversity and suffering and remained faithful to the Lord through it all, through this journey that he took from the pit to the palace. We know also that God blessed this nation of Israel, and when Joseph was at the height of God's given power to him, he had great influence. And at that time, during that famine, he brought his father and siblings went to Egypt to look for food. We talk about being food challenged these days and food insecurities. There was great famine coming to the land of Egypt. The scriptures tell us that the descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. That's important to know, that because the Lord greatly blessed them and increased their number. In fact, the scriptures tell us that they became so numerous that the land was filled with them. And so after they moved to Egypt and more history took place, we know that Joseph and all of his descendants, his generation, died. And as so often happened when the people of God come to that place, the new regime or the new leadership, the new Pharaoh, the new king, that meant nothing to him, what took place and how Joseph had become the prince of Egypt. They were forced into slavery and oppression. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. Isn't that interesting? Eventually they would become a nation of about 2 million people. Then the Pharaoh said that that's enough in order that every male child be thrown into the Nile River. And we'll get to that story soon. We should remember that God had told Abraham back in Genesis 15 these words, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in country not their own, and they'd be enslaved and mistreated there." God also said he would punish the nation they served as slaves, and afterward they would come out with great possessions. Friends, can you imagine being in bondage and in slavery and oppressed as a nation for 400 years? You know, sometimes we feel like we've been in bondage because of this COVID pandemic and the lockdowns that took place in the past years. But imagine, try to fathom 400 years, knowing that even though God promised delivery, it would be a long time off. Friends, I tell you, sometimes it's hard to wait on the Lord, isn't it? Maybe you're waiting for something today. Maybe you've been waiting a long time. I want you to know once again that just in the case of Joseph, God has a plan and purpose for your life and my life. And it may require some waiting, not sitting back on your haunches, if you will, but actively waiting, and while you're waiting, constantly seeking the Lord. You see, God, we know, will deliver his people from the bondage of slavery to Egypt. He would choose another unlikely person, another ordinary person, to accomplish his good and perfect will and his perfect purpose. We know his name as Moses. You see, before Moses was even born, the people of Israel were living as slaves in Egypt. The Pharaoh was afraid of the numbers and might of the growing Israelites. And during that time, so he had them put under extreme bondage and slavery, making bricks out of straw and mud. It got so bad at one time that Pharaoh had to put out an order to have all the male children killed that were being born to the Israelites. We know that story in Jesus' day when Jesus was born, that Herod put out an order to kill all the little boys that were 2 years old or younger, because he was threatened by this new king that was coming. See, during that time, it was when Moses was born. His mother was a Hebrew, which is just another name for an Israelite. When Moses was first born, his mother hid him for 3 months, and then she put him in a reed basket and placed him in the river, hoping someone would find him and raise him up in safely. Well, it just so happened that the daughter of Pharaoh was the one to find him by the river. Now that phrase, "it just so happened," we can apply that to a lot of the scriptures, how God has worked. And oh, by the way, it just so happened that this happened, that Pharaoh's daughter found Moses as a baby. Once she found him, she found out who the mother was and asked the mother to come nurse him for that time that babies are nursed. Once the nursing stage was over, the mother then gave the child back to Pharaoh's daughter in order that she might raise him up as one of her own. And she did this so that Pharaoh would not have him killed. So therefore, we know that Moses was raised in Pharaoh's household. Let's read that story just of his birth, found in Genesis chapter 2. Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and the attendants were walking along the river bank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered, and the girl went and got the baby's mother. It just so happened that the baby's mother was available. "Take the baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." Now remember that in the Old Testament, many times the names that were given to those children had great meaning. And that's exactly what Moses' name, for "I drew him out of the water." One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered the flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." "And where is he?" asked his daughters. "Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat." So Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become an alien in a foreign land." And during that time period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. The late F.B. Meyer wrote about this account. When matters had reached their worst in respect to the Israelites' condition, God was preparing a deliverer. The child was more than ordinarily beautiful, according to the scriptures. His parents hid him by faith. Perhaps they received a special revelation of his great future, or the strength of which they would become strong to resist the royal command. They launched the ark not only on the Nile only, but on God's providence. He would be captain, steersman, and convoy of this tiny bark ark. I like that word. Miriam stood to watch. There was no fear of fatal consequences, only the quiet expectancy that God would do something worthy of himself. They reckoned on God's faithfulness, and they were amply rewarded when the daughter of the greatest foe became the babe's patroness. Once again, friends, we see that God has raised up an ordinary person, the son of Hebrew slaves, to accomplish incredibly extraordinary things for his good and perfect will. You know, he did it for Noah. He did it with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, and now Moses. It's all part of God's great story, that upper story of his redemption. His desire, friends, even today, is to redeem his people, not only from the bondage of slavery and oppression, but also deliver his people from the bondage and slavery of sin, so that you and I can be reconciled to him. You see, Moses was a man born in very troubled times for the nation of Israel, a man who initially had no idea what his destiny was, a man who initially experienced times of great testing, a man who had a poor self-image and could not speak very well. But when the final words, friends, of the story of Moses' life were spoken, we read these words in Deuteronomy 34:10. Since then, no prophet has ever risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Even from this time in Israel's history, the Lord was preparing for the day, you see, that the true deliverer would come, the one who would be the ultimate deliverer and rescuer of men's soul. Of course, we know that as Jesus Christ. You know, whether you're a farmer or a teacher or a nurse or a doctor or a salesman or a preacher, you probably were required to undergo a time of training and education and maybe even some testing. I think that's a universal biblical principle from what I read. Even as a young person in Pharaoh's court, Moses was being prepared for something greater than himself. And as a result of taking matters into his own hands, remember we read about him killing that Egyptian taskmaster, Moses then, for fear for his life, fled to the desert. We know that in the canon of Scripture that Moses' desert experience would be a necessary time ordained by God in order to prepare him for becoming the deliverer of Israel. So Moses spent a lot of time in the desert. Have you ever spent time in the desert of your life, in that wilderness? I know I have. There was a time from the time I entered the insurance business, many years ago now, my hope and desire at that time was to become the chief marketing officer of a major life insurance company. In 1990, I was called by the company that I'd started with a number of years before. So we moved from the New London Spicer area in Minnesota back to Texas to the Dallas area, and lo and behold, here's my chance. Well, as it turned out, it was not the right move for me. Maybe. 3 years later, I was, because of downsizing and the economic climate, my position was eliminated, and there was no hope of me becoming the chief marketing officer. Well, needless to say, friends, I was crushed and I was devastated. I'd always enjoyed a measure of success in my life, and kind of like Moses, he'd gone from the desert to be the deliverer of God's people, but prior to that, he was the prince of Egypt. I felt like I failed my family and I failed God and failed myself, and so I entered into that desert of discontent. But as I reflect back on that experience, although it was painful, God was using that experience, friends, I know, to shape me and mold me, to grind off the rough edges, to prepare me for opportunities that I was yet unaware of. You know, sometimes the University of God can be a daunting experience, but let me tell you from my own personal experience, I would not trade that experience, although painful, for anything. Do I believe that I am attending God's university yet? Of course I am. I'm not through. Neither are you. Through this life's journey, we all experience times and seasons in the desert. I would say to you, expect it. You see, we're lifelong learners, and part of our lifelong learning can be on the mountaintop, but it's also those experiences in the valley. I've heard, and you've heard, that the fertile land is in the valley. That's where we grow. And I would say, be prepared by best you can by walking with the Lord all the days of your life, and when events and circumstances necessitate your enrollment in his wilderness school, we cling to God. It was that way for Moses. He needed more schooling, more leadership training in God's university in the desert. Although he was a man of great intelligence and received an incredible education under the tutelage of Pharaoh, Moses lacked one degree that was offered through the University of God. One of my favorite authors back in the Promise Keeper days was a man named Steve Farrar, and he said this in a book about Moses. I believe the name of the book was If I'm Not Tarzan and My Wife's Not Jane, Then What Am I Doing Here in the Jungle? Great title. But Steve said this: Moses thought he had completed all of his education. He had an Egyptian BA, an MBA, and a PhD, but he lacked one degree. Moses needed the MCA degree. An MCA, according to Farrar, is a master's in character acquisition. For the role that God had planned for Moses, getting that degree was mandatory. You see, God often allows isolation and pain to get our attention in ways that success never can. He uses life's pain to teach us, to mold us, and to make us useful. The pain isn't for nothing. God will use it for his glory. C.S. Lewis wrote a great book called The Problem of Pain. And Mr. Lewis would say that pain is God's megaphone. In our own journeys, we have acquired some knowledge and information through the formal education process like high school and college and maybe beyond, which can be very useful. And some of us find out that the formal education is not useful until we attend to some life experience schooling. But some of us find out that we'll become more effective for the kingdom of God only through attending the University of God in the desert. It was required for Moses. Why do you and I think that it's not required for us? We need to be reminded that even while Moses was in that desert experience, gaining more education and seasoning for the job at hand, God provided for Moses. He provided him with food and clothing and shelter, a family, a vocation, all that he needed. And then, at the age of 80, Moses heard the voice of God from a burning bush. Take off your sandals, Moses. You're standing on holy ground. I have seen the misery of my people. I will rescue them. Moses, you demand. Now, he didn't say that, but Moses was specifically chosen by God for this mission to rescue God's people. And of course, Moses said, "Who, me? You must be mistaken, Lord. Take my brother Aaron. I can't speak. What if they don't listen to me?" Moses was filled with excuses. Sometimes you and I are. I can't do that. But through God, you can do it. I do what I do. God has enabled me to do what I do. I cannot do it in my own strength. Here's a lesson for us. God knows us better, friends, than we know ourselves. We must trust him and obey him when he calls us to do what he's called us to do. Like Moses, we can share our weaknesses with him, but that's not news to him. He was there when you were born. He knew you before you were born. You were fearfully and wonderfully made. You were knit together in your mother's womb for crying out loud. And as Wiersbe once said, the will of God will never lead you where the power of God can't enable you. I like that. So walk by faith in his promises. This was true of Moses. It can be true for you and me. It's interesting to me that Moses' life was really divided into three 40-year segments. 40 is a significant number, in the scriptures. The first 40 years he grew up. He grew up in Pharaoh's court and became the prince of Egypt. Then he spent 40 years in the desert, gaining his master of character acquisition as God was preparing him to be the leader of the nation of Israel out of bondage. And then the last 40 years, beginning that task at age 80. And Moses lived another 40 years. It's another lesson for you and I, friends. We're never too old to serve the Lord. Let me say that again. You are never too old to serve the Lord. I got started in the ministry. I went to seminary at age 49, and the Lord has allowed me to serve him in this capacity for the last 20 years. You can do the math. And then I heard a preacher say about a month ago, saying, if you ain't dead, you ain't done. So God can use you. If you're physically incapacitated, I know you can pray. You can encourage people. There's all kind of ways as we get older that we can serve the Lord, encourage other people. So Moses, as we know, went to Pharaoh in the power of the Lord, and the word tells us that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And then, of course, through Moses, God sent all these plagues. I can't imagine the plagues. The Nile turned blood red, frogs and lice and gnats and diseased livestock and boils, hail, locusts, darkness. After each of these, Pharaoh would not be moved. And then the 10th plague, the plague of death. The firstborn of every male will die. God instructed Moses to tell the families to slaughter and eat the meat of an unblemished lamb. He instructed them to take some of the blood from the unblemished lamb and paint it over the doorpost of their homes. And the Lord said, I will bring judgment on all the gods of Israel. I, the Lord, the blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. That's where we get Passover. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt, except that plague struck Pharaoh's son. He lost his firstborn to death. And because of that, he released the Israelites. They were free. Oh, yes, he changed his mind. He paid the price again at the Red Sea as God delivered his people, as he parted the Red Sea. So God rescued them twice, really, from Pharaoh in bondage and from being drowned in the Red Sea and slaughtered by Pharaoh. What an incredible picture of what God has done for you and me. How God delivered the people from Israel from bondage and slavery. How Jesus Christ, the blood of Christ, delivers you and I from the bondage and slavery of sin. I just listened to Rich Mullins' classic song, My Deliverer, and it sends chills through me now. I encourage you to find it on YouTube or Google it on your phone and listen to Rich Mullins' My Deliverer. You see, just as the Lord delivered his people from bondage, God sent his Son to deliver us. You see, friends, I want you to know this. The deliverance from sin is free, but you must ask for it. Humble yourselves. If you've never asked God to forgive you, and if you've never repented, ask the Lord to apply the blood of Jesus Christ to your life, and he will save you. There's so much here, friends. We do a flyover as we talk about these great stories of God, but what do we take away from this? What do we learn from the scriptures? It's about faith and perseverance. We read in Hebrews 11, again, that great Heroes Hall of Fame, by faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who was invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. It was by faith the people crossed the Red Sea, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do, were drowned. So friends, we said last week, I quoted Charles Stanley in talking about the story of Joseph. And that was these words: obey God and leave the consequences to him. In these grand stories that we read, whether it be Joseph or Moses, we see that obedience pays, if you will, and we leave the consequences or the outcome to God. Moses obeyed and persevered, friends. So should we. So if you find yourself in that desert experience today, let me encourage you that God knows you. He knows where you are. He's not unaware. Cling to him, trust him, obey him, and leave the consequences to him. Go in peace and serve him only. Amen. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. Go in peace and serve the Lord.